Thank you, Matt. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And this is it's a very fast moving time. So anything we say today at the time of recording might already in a few days' time be obsolete. That's the nature of war, of crisis, of honestly everything. So to say a little bit about my company is a political risk consultancy. We basically provide custom analysis and research into political events that might impact the economic or philanthropic interests of our clients. We usually work with ultra high net worth individuals, sometimes with government officials. Often people need to sort of bypass the absolute mess that is bureaucratic information and get an answer to something relatively quickly. These are very specialized services, but we also provide a more, let's call it a more democratic service, the Bismarck Brief. It's a weekly newsletter. If you subscribe at brief.bismarckanalysis.com, once a week, you're going to get an in-depth report on one topic that matters for understanding the strategic landscape. Through the course of a year, we cover basically everything that at the highest level matters. So it's an analysis based on fundamentals, institutional, organizational, economic, political, that's not news driven. One of the reasons that some of my content has traveled so well recently, and honestly, not just my content, my team's content, has been that we've been looking at the Russian military for quite a while. And it was sort of inevitable it would eventually come up. If you remember 2 or 3 months ago, the Russian military already intervened in Kazakhstan to stabilize an allied government. So it's this kind of thing where you're not trying to predict a specific event. You instead are trying to predict and describe, accurately model all of the moving pieces that drive these events.
Accurately modeling all the moving pieces, driving them. And there are so many. And that's where so much of the commentary has unfortunately become linear and also limited in time and remembrance as viewing this conflict as starting just a week ago. And of course, this is something that has been going on for quite some time. So first off, and one topic that you've shown particular expertise on is the composition of the Russian military and its trajectory in becoming, and Putin essentially reforming it into a ground-based military power, beginning with the reformist movement in, I believe it was 2007, leaving it today a fighting force that is heavily reliant on heavy artillery and ground forces as compared to air power. If you could tell us a little bit about that trajectory, even tracing back to the end days of the Soviet Union and how Vladimir Putin modernized and reformed the military and leading up to our current situation.
Well, one of the things that people have to keep in mind is that the Russian military has always co-evolved with the Western military, right? Even the extreme emphasis on air supremacy, sure, for the United States has a legacy in World War II, but was really developed as a primary strategy during the Cold War. Air supremacy has many things to recommend it, including a relatively low rate of casualties. You go in, you bomb everything. Only then, once you have complete air supremacy, completely unchallenged, do you move in tanks, do you move in troops, you go in, you go out. This mode of warfare, the United States has excelled at. It's excelled, let's say, less well at, occupation, nation building, all of these other aspects that follow the war itself. But the war fighting itself is like the most successful modern way to wage war. It is, however, not the only way to wage war. And many people have been perplexed, some of them honestly overly optimistic as to the events in Ukraine, because what they saw was that the Russian military was moving ahead without air superiority. And according to American doctrine, if you don't have air superiority and you're moving in, this is a disastrous, even desperate situation. For the Russian doctrine, nothing could be further from the truth. Even in the 1980s, when this co-evolution started, right, where Russia and the United States were constantly adapting to each other, Soviet Marshal Ogarkov noted that the United States air supremacy basically can't be challenged. All that you can really do is counteract it with extremely strong anti-air defenses. However, just because you have established extremely strong anti-air defenses, this gives you at best occasional air superiority. It does not give you air supremacy. This means you can't deliver munitions where they're needed. And this means that actually you need to rely on very mobile artillery. So, in other words, the Russians deliver munitions through artillery. And in the first days of this conflict today in Ukraine, artillery was used sparingly because if you imagine the use of artillery in something like capturing a city, it's absolutely devastating. It's absolutely terrible. You level city blocks. You don't fight for city blocks. This is bad PR. It increases casualties. It makes the population resist and hate you. But you know what? All of that's happened already. So I suspect the gloves will be off. It'll be an absolutely terrible sight in the coming weeks to see this artillery deployed. But, focusing a little bit more on the history that went to the present day, these reforms by Marshal Garkov in the 1980s were only partially implemented. The Soviet bureaucracy was rigid, right? It was stuck in a different mode of war. It was stupidly, actually, for the most part, trying to mimic what the United States was doing, which was this brilliant American strategy to cause the Soviets to spend themselves into oblivion, trying to match tit for tat every single American capability. Like, note this went super far, even to domains that are not related to military. When America launched its space shuttle, the Soviets launched the Buran space shuttle. When France was unveiling its civilian supersonic passenger transport, the Concorde, a joint British-French effort. The Russians unveiled their own civilian, supersonic plane, and, they even flew it at great losses, et cetera, et cetera. There was just no rationale to this symmetry except pure competitiveness, except prestige, and except the illusion that in the 1980s, everyone knew was an illusion, that one day the Soviet economy would grow enough to catch up to its military expenditures. That obviously did not happen. So in the chaos of the 1990s, the Russian military was reduced to a big, rusting, old Soviet system that didn't even work on its own terms, that had been misbuilt to begin with. This all changed, though, in the early 2000s with the so-called New Look reforms, which we can get into if they're interesting.
Just for if you just briefly describe, I'd say the main objective of those reforms as in their relevance to where the Russian military stands within the context of this conflict.
Right. The so-called New Look reforms were the reforms that started under the Russian reformist defense minister Anatoly Serdyukov, who served from 2007 to 2012. The most interesting thing about this is, can you imagine how large the efficiency gains would be if the United States today appointed the head of the IRS to be the head of the DOD? That's literally what Putin did. He took a guy from the taxation service.
His head tax minister, right, and said we need to implement strict economic efficiencies in this military. We're not wasting a dollar.
Exactly, because they didn't have a dollar to waste, right? The economy of Russia is, famously relatively weak, though we can get into the details of why that's exaggerated a little bit later.
Sure.
And what happened was there was this absolutely brutal discipline on the relevant generals. Like, there were some generals that were dismissed on the basis of them failing to meet fitness standards. Now, okay, everyone wants to have good-looking generals, but that's clearly just a paper-thin excuse to get rid of a guy that you don't want in the military command structure, that likely has a vested economic interest, because let's remember, corruption problems were extremely pervasive in the Russian military in the 1990s and early 2000s. So all of this stuff, the first step was cut all the fat, cut all the superfluous spending. Second, implement these reforms that were designed from the start, where you basically change the structure of the military units. So the military units always have mobile artillery. Something very important is that for the most part, unlike the United States, almost every single artillery piece Russia has is the self-propelled artillery piece. It's mobile, right? It moves. Second, when Russia buys drones, and it did buy many, many drones, the drones do not themselves deliver munitions. What they instead are reconnaissance drones linked to the artillery, improving the accuracy and flexibility of the artillery. So if you imagine a drone is launched, it examines targets, artillery shoots, the drone reports back immediately what kind of corrections are needed, the artillery shoots again, the artillery becomes extremely flexible. And notably also, the cost of delivering firepower is much lower for artillery than aircraft. Add to this mobile personnel, transports, add tanks and so on, and you have something that's extremely formidable, very blunt instrument, but a very cost-effective instrument if you're willing to pay the political cost.
And not as much shock and awe is off the table. The Russians are not a shock and awe military. The United States, and it's a fascinating prism to look at it through, is that American citizens for warfare since let's call it the first Gulf War, which was many people refer to as the first televised war, the first war of the cable news era, 24-hour news cycle era, and they're so used to seeing the initial images of war as being the way they experience this is imagery of air power, the night vision goggles, the green laser
carriers,
bombs,
the plane taking off the aircraft carrier.
That is not. They are not used to seeing a slow moving, realistic, but heavy artillery ground forces. It's not how they've experienced war, and it appears to be what threw people off in their initial reaction to this, and believing that because the Russians were unable to achieve all their military objectives within the first 72 hours of the war, that somehow their master plan had all unraveled, and this was not necessarily that. And we'll get into detail on this in a minute, but while Ukrainian resistance did probably outshoot its initial projections, this was simply not a myth, and that the Soviet, the Russian military and its planning was built for a longer, slower, and more artillery heavy force, and that was what was coming at some point, whether one way or another.
Well, to a significant.
Continue.
All I was going to say. To a significant extent, I think the Ukrainian military has outperformed, and the Ukrainian citizens have shown remarkable patriotism and willingness to fight, and that these are all significant surprises. But the very fact that they are surprises says something important about the underlying balance of power here. The other surprise was the Russians are willing to take casualties. Now, of course, Russia is a much older country today than it was in the 1980s or even the 1990s. Its manpower reserves are lower. However, this is a consistent feature of this style of warfare. The Second Chechen War, right? It really did bleed Russia, not just the Chechens. They absolutely leveled in this slow, grinding approach. Cities like Grozny looked like the surface of the moon. And you might think that this would make the Chechen people a permanent enemy of the occupying Russians. However, a Chechen strongman was installed, basically given all the rights to repress his own people as much as needed, and in exchange, he has supported Putin ever since. We should remember, right, that the siege of Grozny was when Putin first sort of made his name in Russian politics.
Yes. And endeared himself to the Russian people, it appears, and it's and something that people seem flummoxed about is how it appears that a number of Chechen battalions are some of the most fierce and forthright Russian fighting forces thus far in this conflict.
The result of this has been that there's been 20 years of building up a completely loyal force to this little statelet or fiefdom in Chechnya, right? Federal Russian forces have very little influence as to what goes on in Chechnya itself. It is de facto a small independent country in all but name and in all but foreign policy, just personally tied to Vladimir Putin, something that is politically extremely useful. If you imagine that you are an autocrat and you have a political reserve of fighting men, fighting people that is completely uncorrelated with the normal military, this is great insurance in case of a coup. So one way to think of the Chechens is that, sure, they're tough fighters, but those units are in a way almost military police forces. They're there to really watch out for any sort of treason in the Russian military. They're there to occupy the region. So that is sort of their role.
And what I imagine, there's no particular ethnic allegiance or affection between the Chechens and the Ukrainians?
No. And that's a classic imperial strategy. Like if you think of something like the Ottoman Empire or even the old Russian Empire, you always take people from one side of the empire to fight those on the very other end, right? So, or let's say during World War I, right, when Austro-Hungary had a Serbian population, they would never send their Serbian soldiers to fight Russians. They would send their Serbian soldiers to fight Italians, right? And their Italian soldiers to fight Russians. This way, there are fewer defections. There's less empathy, less sympathy. You weaponize old hatreds. And this is something that's just a universal feature of many empires throughout human history. And it's still used today by modern states.
Absolutely, and something that us in the West just refuse to acknowledge in so many ways, and that there's a multifaceted, three-dimensional, the ethnic conflict with a history of ethnic tensions and rivalries in this region that all funnel into this battle. And speaking of which, it seems that everybody forgets that the conflict, let's call it, raging on the eastern side of the Ukraine and on the Russian border. I mean, it does not appear that this war, quote unquote, began a week ago. It appears that it really began about 8 years ago and simply escalated over the past week. And I'd love your thoughts on the accuracy or inaccuracy of the belief here that essentially, the events of 2014, as I and many other people understand them to be, the Ukraine. At the time, the president was a democratically elected individual named Viktor Yanukovych. He was Russian friendly, but not necessarily a vassal of Russia. He's simply a little more sympathetic, a little more Russian friendly. There was a large trade package proposed to him by the European Union. A lot of members of his government and a lot of the youth of the Ukraine wanted to start to ally with the European Union, perhaps even join the EU and take advantage of the many benefits, in terms of
economic development, various rights of migration and so on. Yes.
Rights of migration, perfectly said. And Putin came in and threatened some pretty significant economic sanctions, proposed a counter trade package, and Yanukovych took the Russian trade package instead of the EU trade package. In response, a number of elements in the Ukrainian government, or some kind of grassroots element with support of the United States government and the West, took to the streets, and street demonstrations essentially overthrew Yanukovych, which then led to Putin invading and annexing Crimea. And that pretty much since then, there's been somewhat of a conflict raging in this region the entire time in varying degrees of intensity over the past 8 years, but that this war right now is simply an extension of that. Is that a correct understanding?
I think it very much is a correct understanding, because fighting has taken place this entire time, with a brief interlude when the so-called Minsk Accords paused fighting. Now, to be clear, the fighting was not taking place in Crimea. After the annexation of Crimea, that front was stationary. However, two statelets, the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, declared independence. These are basically Russian-backed, entities that probably have local support among ethnic Russians and Russian speakers, because in 2014, Ukraine was much more torn on the question of pro-Western or pro-Russian. There was division across the country, right? When we talk about the culture war, right, in the United States, that was a real culture war, okay? They were disagreeing about which direction their country should go in. And it was divided right across the middle. So if you had in 2014 split Ukraine into two countries, one of those countries would have been Russia aligned, right? And we see this evidence of this, that, the annexation of Crimea was basically illegal on a technicality, right? Crimea declared independence after probably a staged referendum, joined Russia as a Russian territory. It's not acknowledged as a Russian territory by most states. Most states continue to view Crimea for the entire last 8 years as Ukrainian territory. So let me just emphasize, it's not justified in that sense. However, having said all of that, the fact that there was no insurgency in Crimea, the fact that people in general seemed genuinely pleased that to join the Russian Federation, I think the majority of the population of Crimea wanted to be part of the Russian Federation. So I think that was a complicated situation, much more, in a way, morally complicated than what's happening today. I wouldn't call it justified, but just in fact, the reality is that, Crimea was an easy thing for Russia to integrate. Having said that, Luhansk and Donetsk, very different. Fighting took place in those provinces. The statelets never managed to claim the entire regions, right? These were administrative regions before they declared independence. Further, the Russians never accepted them as members of the Russian Federation. They didn't even acknowledge them as independent countries. They instead pushed for high autonomy while these regions remained part of Ukraine. Why would Russia do this? Well, it's a little bit of a weight around Ukraine's neck so that it could never really go to the West. As long as you had these two regions that are technically part of Ukraine, that have significant rights, perhaps even veto rights on foreign policy, you could not have a Ukraine that enters NATO. You could not have a Ukraine possibly that even enters the European Union. The so-called, again, Minsk Accords solidified this as the standing deal between Russia and Ukraine. What's happening now?
And so my understanding of sorry, continue.
Well, what's happened now?
Sorry, one quick question is about the Minsk Accords. Apologies. My understanding was that there was a disagreement over the true interpretation of the Minsk Accords, that Russia interpreted as including a guarantee that the Ukraine would not join NATO, and Ukraine interpreted it otherwise, and that even the consideration of even the discussions and public, even the Americans publicly stating that they would not, that they believed that the Ukraine had the right to potentially join NATO, the Russians saw as a breach of the Minsk Accords. Would that be correct?
That would be correct. Also, Russia felt it, the Russian position is that NATO has been, of course, encroaching in its sphere of interest, right, for a very, very long time. They talk about 5 waves of expansion of NATO into what they consider to be, their sort of former sphere of influence. And it is unacceptable as a security risk to have offensive weaponry, offensive missiles in Ukraine. And we have to be a little bit honest here. When the United States first expanded to include countries like Poland in the defense umbrella, and they set up anti-missile defense systems, the official line from Washington back then was there would be no offensive missiles in places like Poland and Romania. And this is just false, right? Again, not to root for the Russians, but to be realistic, right? To be realistic, that was a false statement by Western governments. So why in the world would, from the Russian perspective, they trust that, it's a defensive alliance, we're only expanding into Ukraine and we're going to have defensive weapons? It's a matter of time before missiles are set up there. And once missiles are set up there, that's 10 minutes from Moscow. If it's a hypersonic missile, that's crazy. That's not even enough time for the Russian president to have a conversation as to whether they should launch the nukes. It's not even enough to bring a Russian equivalent of the nuclear football to the president. Okay. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And in thinking of this through a purely strategic lens, that if you continue to strategically encroach on a hostile actor, you cannot be that surprised when eventually they take countervailing action. And that seems to be the calculus here. And where the conversation around this has really been scrambled is trying to frame any acknowledgement of those strategic realities we just described as some sort of Russian-friendly or pro-Russian perspective. No, it's simply acknowledging the realities of geopolitics and military strategy.
I think people often believe that words are as important a tool of fighting wars as bullets are. And I think this is, can sometimes, it can sometimes be true, okay? But this war is not proceeding at the speed of a tweet, okay? It's proceeding at the speed of a tank, right? And tanks move slowly. They have severe logistic requirements. I recommend to any listeners to, just go watch a replay of the U.S. invasion in Iraq that actually is a really fast one, has the shock and awe. And you note how slowly troops move into the country, how slowly tanks move into the country, or compare the modern campaign in Ukraine to something that happened 80 years ago, the literal German blitzkrieg through Poland. It took weeks. People forget this in the history books. You would think that this is like a good day of tweeting, a good day of following this on the internet, and it's done. No, this is going to be a weeks-long affair. And in this time, there's another misunderstanding, sort of the very concept of enforcing a no-fly zone versus Ukraine is exactly the contingency the Russian military, the Russian land army was designed to counteract. Their whole, half of their purpose is to deliver firepower through artillery. The other half is to shoot down as many NATO planes as you possibly can.
Mm-hmm.
So that's foolhardy. That's just not technically possible for the Western allies.
It seems incredibly reckless, and if there's any saving grace, the Biden administration seems at the end of the day to understand the absurdity and the risks along with trying to enforce a no-fly zone. That is essentially, in this case, would be tantamount to a declaration of war. Okay, so these types of conflicts moving at the speed of tanks, not tweets. Let's get to the military realities and status on the ground as we speak. Many stories coming out with some of that relatively ham-fisted initial performance by the Russians, although that's been exaggerated, but there do seem to be some logistical hiccups. In analyzing war, you matching tactics to logistics. You could have the best tactics and have the best plan, but if you don't have the logistics in place to get oil to your tanks and get the ammunition to your guns, that's going to be a problem. So how any of the tactical or logistical foibles of the Russians so far, how significant are they, and what is the military situation on the ground as pertains to the major target cities like Kiev?
As it comes to Kiev, the real battle for Kiev has not really begun. But it's very important to note that, in the south, there are in fact cities that have been confirmed to be taken by the Russians. So the advance from Crimea has advanced fairly rapidly, with the first major cities reporting that they are basically, captured. The city of Kherson, Mariupol, these cities are, if they're not already fully captured by Russians, they will soon be. A lot of cities are getting wrecked. Kharkov in the east. For Kiev itself, I think the symbolic importance of the city, the symbolic importance of the city means that a successful operation there is sort of crucial for the Russians. Any sort of massive defeat there would prolong the war significantly, because it would correctly prove that there's some hope for a remnant Western Ukraine. Now, this again, the fact that I'm saying hope for a remnant Western Ukraine shows that I unfortunately don't think there's a hope in Eastern Ukraine. I think Russian forces will be victorious there. But the logistics difficulties of the extremely long convoy everyone's reporting on, that is embarrassing to the Russian state. That is, in fact, something that has exceeded their logistical capabilities. Now, previously, the Russians actually had shockingly good logistics for small expeditionary forces. What should be remembered is that Russia successfully intervened in Syria and kept its small force there supplied. This is the first large war that Russia has fought in recent history. This is not Georgia. This is not a peacekeeping operation in Armenia. This is not a limited operation in Syria. This is not even, the very interesting hybrid war approach of taking Crimea in a mostly peaceful manner. This will have massive strains on their logistics. And the interesting question is, will they be able to resolve these over the next 2 weeks? If they resolve them over the next 2 weeks, I think that Kiev will easily be taken. And if not, this could drag on for months, battles in Kiev itself.
Wow. So their logistic foibles thus far can be overcome. We'd anticipate that they will be overcome, and that this was something that was a failure of a kind of military intervention of first impression, that most of their objectives previously, since they have rebuilt and modernized the military, were much smaller than this one. And this is why this is the most significant military conflict in Europe in God knows how long. And I guess the Russians are experiencing some growing pains in that regard. So
I do believe they will eventually develop the logistical capability. It's just, it's always the case when you start a war. It's usually just an unmitigated disaster for almost anyone. Yeah. So if you ever read any close histories or even closely read on recent conflicts, you realize that so many things go wrong that could not be predicted, right? And it's always a disaster. And then the key test of a military and a political system is the flexibility to endure initial problems and basically troubleshoot them until you have a smooth military machine running.
No doubt. And once again, where a lot of American perspectives have been skewed by the televised air bombardment that has been kind of how we've primarily experienced American war over the past 30 years, I'd say. And so mapping out Putin's true objectives here, and obviously we're acknowledging that his objectives here were more significant than those of recent military interventions over the past decade or so. One, he says that he has no interest in occupying the Ukraine. Is that true? Two, is regime change a firm, fixed objective of this military incursion?
I think that anything short of regime change is at this point sort of a strategic defeat of Russia, though that unfortunately does not mean a victory for Ukraine. Russia will certainly succeed in taking territories away from Ukraine. Luhansk and Donetsk are most likely going to be directly annexed into the Russian Federation. As for the rest of Ukraine, I think the goal is to establish a local strongman, a local regime that represses the Ukrainians for Putin. And Putin's view is that over a 20-year period, much as the Chechens have come around, the Ukrainians will come around. And this puppet state entity will, I don't know whether, depending on how well the war goes, Putin might decide to completely deprive it of access to the Black Sea. No, that's extremely important. Places like Odessa, Crimea has already been taken, right? The coastline along the Sea of Azov. That stuff was already in a way baked in 2014, where, let's remember, when Crimea was taken, half of the Ukrainian naval fleet was taken. This is why Russia has naval supremacy in the Black Sea versus the Ukrainians today. Had Crimea not been taken and such an operation was undertaken, we would see serious naval battles and resistance from the Ukrainian Navy. And that's not what we're seeing, of course. So that's what I mean by baked in. The Russians can operate navally with impunity in the Black Sea unless it's escalated with NATO interventions. And even when it comes to NATO, Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey, their navies are still weaker than the Russian Navy in the region. It would take the US Navy, right? It would take Western allies such as France and the United Kingdom. And that would be, that would be a world war for real. But to go back to the question of what is the objective, I think it's the toppling of the government in Kiev, a replacement with an aligned Russian government. This government probably joins the Union State being the entity that unifies Russia and Belarus. This has often been considered a paper entity, but in recent years, it's become more and more real. Belarus is supporting Russia in its invasion. That's why a Kiev operation was even possible within the first few days, because Russian troops went down from Belarus. Further, Belarus has now passed laws that allow the placement of foreign strategic weapons in the country. In other words, there are probably Russian ICBMs being driven right now across the border into Belarus, shortening flight times to various targets in Western Europe. And I'm sure this has not escaped Western military planners. Finally, there's evidence, and there's at least that's what the Russian and Belarus government are indicating, that the Belarus will join the fight directly. So what I'm saying here is the Union State might, after this war, be made into a real entity. Large chunks of eastern Ukraine, Luhansk and Donetsk, maybe even a land bridge to Crimea itself around the Sea of Azov, those are very likely to go into the Russian Federation proper. Odessa, I'm less certain. I would not be surprised if eventually the war is expanded to include Moldova. Moldova has a breakaway statelet that has existed within official Moldovan borders since the 1990s, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that little statelet has, through this entire period, hosted Russian troops. I think it's called Transnistria. And
fascinating. And so this was a question
Moldova,
that a friend of mine
posed. NATO member, so that's very important, right? It is a similar situation to Ukraine.
And to that point, and a friend of mine had inquired on this earlier, is there any red line that if Putin does cross would trigger, because once again, the international community has come out very strongly against him mimetically and economically, but not militarily. What is the red line that he crosses that does catalyze the international community and or NATO to militarily intervene? Is it strictly the expansion of the war to either a NATO, another NATO country, or let's call it a NATO adjacent, NATO friendly other Baltic or Eastern European nation, other than Moldova, I'd imagine?
I think that's almost the only circumstance where the war would be escalated, because, and this is absolutely terrible, but I think Western claims of humanitarianism are just false. There are genocides, there are atrocities carried out all over the world. The Western world does not care. There's no attention brought to them. Sometimes it's even fueled indirectly through economic or other measures. And, again, it's just this reality where it's overriding security concerns that drive these interventions. The humanitarian aspect, it's sort of a weird luxury. You only get to do humanitarian interventions when you're so hegemonic, so powerful, versus whatever tin pot dictator you're looking at, that it does not expend any serious force to push them back. So if I see a situation where something like this could happen, it would be a situation where, let's say, I find it plausible that Romanian, Polish forces might, ununiformed, start participating in the later stages of the war in Western Ukraine. If the Russians consider these already acts of NATO aggression and they crossed the border of Poland and Romania, even for limited strikes, even for very limited incursions, I think that would be a red line where NATO would be activated. So the final stage of the war in Western Ukraine, which I expect will happen unless the Kiev government comes to some sort of armistice, in which case both Ukraine and Russia lose. Ukraine loses its eastern territories. It, of course, defeats Russia in the sense that Russia doesn't get its war aims. But outside of that scenario, I think the most dangerous phase of this war is going to be weeks from now, when fighting is happening in Western Ukraine.
Yeah, the spillover and a little bit of the mission creep from some surrounding territories. And you mentioned the humanitarian concerns, and it feels you've also separately mentioned mimetic versus kinetic, and the mimetic war, info war, funneled through social media and broadcast media. And so I'm wondering, is the humanitarian concerns almost seem to be lay more on the side of the mimetic ledger, in that the mimetic battle being fought frames this as a humanitarian issue, and that the West needs to intervene, in whether economically or militarily, because of humanitarian concerns. And that now seems to include this hero mythology around Zelensky. And I'm wondering if that mimetic hero mythology now becomes problematic in providing no off-ramp, and that Zelensky essentially will not surrender power. And once again, I'm not saying that he should surrender power, and saying that there may be a strategic situation in which the unfortunately best option is to surrender power. That the space for him to do so now becomes smaller, increasing the likelihood that Russia accelerates or ramps up additional military pressure or destruction, because in order to achieve those goals of a new friendly puppet government.
I think at this point, given the harshness of the economic sanctions, especially, the only remaining economic sanction that could be undertaken is one that Europe is not going to easily take. That would be ceasing the import of Russian gas. Note that with all of these sanctions, the gas continues to flow from Russia to Germany, and the Germans would feel quite a bit of pain if they shut off that gas. So that's the last, I think, remaining economic sanction. Once that happens, I think that is a sign of not a military escalation, but a new low for hostilities, right? Because that's the point where German consumers and German industry would pay a very real cost for its lack of energy. But not to get too distracted by the energy question, the mimetic war, well, I think the attempt is to revive something like 1990s era NATO ideology, The sort of, world policeman. We're just an impartial technocratic force. We're here to enforce human rights. We're here to protect people. It's very righteous.
Once again, as you mentioned, that we have the luxury, America as it stands in 1998, as the sole hegemonic power, has the luxury of such dalliances. And it feels like a lot of American actors or commentators have carried that vision forward into an era where we do not have the hegemonic standing to take advantage of such luxuries.
Well, not in this stage, right? It's not 1990, 1998. It's not even 2001. It's not even 2004. We would well do to realize that the limits on Western power are very significant. European militaries are much weaker relative to rivals than they were in 1995. Okay. The German military, of course, now there's been a big spending package where the German military has, at least in theory, received assurance from the chancellor that there'll be an extra 100 billion euros spent on it. But do you know that they've been slashing budgets for basically almost every year for the last 20 years? The capabilities of the once fearsome West German military that became the German military, those are long gone. There's really nothing Germany can do except economically pursue it. And, Britain, France, these are shadows of what they were, again, even in the 1990s. And even in the 1990s, European powers were reluctant to intervene in the much smaller conflict in Yugoslavia because they understood how many planes they would lose. They understood how many soldiers they would lose. They let the U.S. lead the charge, and the U.S. was truly in the strongest possible position you can imagine. It was the undisputed sole remaining world superpower, to the point where it didn't think twice about bombing Belgrade and hitting the Chinese embassy, something that to this day is a source of wounded pride and a source of grievance with some substance against the United States in modern day China. Recent news of the Russian invasion were accompanied in the Chinese internet. And we should remember there's another planet out there. There's another internet that we don't get to see, and they don't get to see our internet, right? We block them, they block us. It's this strange parallel reality. On their internet, people brought up the bombing of Belgrade, and people reported being moved to tears or cheering when seeing Putin's speech televised, being like, oh my God, finally, there's someone that's explained what's been done to China. And we're so happy to see Russia stand up to the US. So their perspective is that Russia is standing up to the US, right? That's kind of the Chinese internet perspective right now. And It sounds very strange to us, but this should tell you once more that in the mimetic world, the 1990s are over. There's no longer one planetary mind. There are at least two, possibly three, possibly more. There's the Russian internet, the Chinese internet, and the American internet. And the news networks, well, those disentangled long ago, right? You had alternative media organizations like Al Jazeera, Russia Today, RT was a very successful network. Of course, now it's getting banned in the Western world. I'm sure Russia is if it hasn't already, it'll ban the BBC in response, or the Washington Post, or whatever. So these are very different information compartments. So when we have information warfare in the West right now, I think very little of it reaches Russians. Very little of it reaches Chinese. It is mostly there to bolster our resolve, to bolster morale, maybe to help the Ukrainians somewhat. But, at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter if Zelensky is built up as this great hero if he still loses the war. Like, maybe it matters on a 60-year time scale. Maybe there'll be, Ukrainian nationalist organizations that have him as an emblem, that are operating from abroad and causing trouble for Russia, et cetera, et cetera. But, honestly, that melts away over time. It's like, if you think of, ironically, a different episode from Russian history, the so-called White Russian movement, right? The pro-czarist forces and pro-democracy forces that lost to the Bolsheviks, they slowly melted away after they had lost the Russian Civil War, right? Over the decades, they started off as a real force outside of Russia, and then that organization slowly eroded away. Mythology does not overcome that erosion.
And so there will be a military reality on the ground, or a safety reality for President Zelensky, where if Kyiv is sieged, if it's clear that Ukrainian military forces are about to capitulate, that God knows, he could end up in exile on Elba like Napoleon, or we'll find somewhere else for him.
I think he'll have a comfortable life in the West, where here perhaps it's good to think of President Saakashvili of Georgia. You remember that, right? After the war between Russia and Georgia, Saakashvili lost power. And he went to the West and he became a university professor for a little bit. And then he went to Ukraine and became a representative in Ukrainian parliament. So I would not be shocked if I was Zelensky and I thought Ukraine was lost and, had time to go. I wouldn't be surprised if the Polish people might not welcome me as a Polish politician, right? Poland at this point is very anti-Russian. As long as he learned Polish, I wouldn't be shocked if he became a major public figure there.
No doubt. One more point on the mimetic aspect of this, and we're hearing somewhat of the internal narrative that Putin is pushing regarding this particular Ukrainian government and some of its elements, trying to frame it as just another corrupt kleptocracy with neo-Nazi elements. And then at first glance, at least to us in the West, this seems ridiculous. How could it have neo-Nazi elements if it's been in power and is democratically elected, and has this wonderful President Zelensky who's Jewish at its helm? But then you dig a little bit deeper and it seems like there are some aspects of at least, whether the government or paramilitary or paragovernmental actors who may have some, if not neo-Nazi, some quite hard right nationalist leanings. You hear names thrown around like the Azov Battalion, Svoboda Party, C14, or sometimes referred to as S14. To what extent are Putin's claims of these Nazi or hard right elements true or false?
I think they're basically true, though the fact is that those units were significantly purged from political power that it for a brief time seemed like they might acquire after Maidan. What I have to also raise here is context. I think the comparison with former Yugoslavia is very fruitful, both in Croatia and Serbia. Officially, the governments at the time did not support these extremist far-right ideologies, but both of them were very happy to arm and train technically non-government militias fighting in Bosnia with those ideologies. And today it is the official policy of the Ukrainian state to give weapons to whoever will fight for Ukraine. There's no ideological test there. There's no moral or ethical test there. And honestly, as a desperate war measure, I understand it. So my prediction is the longer the war lasts, the more the hardcore units will be composed of groups that are political extremists of various stripes.
And so I don't know if you've seen this video floating around, but I'd love your take on it. A gentleman named Gonzalo Lira, an English speaker who at least appears to be a resident of the Ukraine, Kyiv, and mentions and did about a 2-minute video that went viral mentioning that the Ukrainian government, once again, not that this means that they have the moral compunction here in this battle, but that they essentially armed anyone who wanted to be armed, they armed, and arms fell into the hands of some thugs and bad actors. And Kyiv is now a crime-ridden cesspool, essentially, because all of these criminals that the Ukrainian government was arming ostensibly to fight the Russians, and to a certain extent, maybe they have taken arms up for legitimate causes against the Russians, but are also running rampant on their own personal criminal activity throughout the city. I'm wondering if you've seen that video or if you've heard any inklings of the truth or falsity of this.
I've seen the video. I basically think that I think we should expect about half of all the news we hear, either from Russian or Western sources, to be lies. There have been multiple videos that have been edited and doctored on both sides. There have been multiple videos that have been mislabeled. Photography, right? There's just a lot of false information traveling around here. Having said all of this, it's hardly unprecedented for organized crime to make use of a national emergency, right? Or a war. And Ukraine, much like Russia has a serious problem from the Soviet era inherited of very well-developed organized crime networks, often connected with international crime networks. So I don't even know how to begin to evaluate the true situation of whether this problem is worse in Russia or Ukraine. But the fact that that is an open question, I think, says volumes.
No doubt. Moving on, and we'd kind of touched on a bit of the energy situation previously, but I want to dive into that more substantially here. There is a Twitter thread by Arizona Senate candidate Blake Masters, who's become somewhat of a notable talking head on social media, and you had retweeted this, and his perspective on this situation was quite interesting. His first tweet: "The situation in Ukraine is dangerous. It's hard to tell what's going on beyond that because we don't have a real media. Neither does Ukraine, and neither does Russia." To your point just a minute ago, that we have to be skeptical of media coming from all sources. Do your own thinking. Here's some of mine. How was this possible, meaning this conflict? Why was Putin tempted to think that violence would work? The answer is two big blind spots of Western leaders: energy and power. So going back to our what we were discussing earlier about simple strategic realities. Clearly, Russia has been preparing for this for a while in stacking its strategic chips and economic leverage and dependence from, stacking the West's economic dependence on him through oil, gas, and natural resources. And that seems to be even firmer leverage than a lot of people had anticipated, because, as you mentioned, the oil hasn't shut off. The Western Europe still needs oil and gas.
And the gas have not shut off, yes.
And so, if you could expand on that, given just the extent of Western Europe's dependence on Russia for oil, gas, and natural resources, and whether, your belief or disbelief that Putin had anticipated the West's reaction to any military dalliances of his, and that he knew that he had this card to play and is playing it pretty well.
Europe has been pursuing a green energy policy for a long time. But what's usually not discussed when it comes to the goal of increasing efficiency, introducing green energy, is the severe problems of intermittent power. The sun does not shine on a schedule, right? Sure, There's day and night, but weather exists. Further, wind is in a way even worse, so it has the advantage of being decorrelated from sunshine. Finally, a lot of countries in Europe, like the United Kingdom and Germany, are just very cloudy countries. They're not California, they're not Texas, they're definitely not Spain. So at the end of the day, solar power can only bear so much. So when you start closing down nuclear power plants, as was done in Germany, you either run coal or you try to run renewables. If you run renewables, the natural complement to renewables is natural gas. Natural gas can be turned up and turned down to help solve problems of intermittency, right? The power grid has demand that's not met. You can compensate that demand with electricity. This gas is then the gas that would have been otherwise used to heat homes and so on. So this increases gas prices pretty directly. With regard to heating homes, that's a little bit of a more complex problem. Like, you maybe could transition to various forms of biofuel and so on, and there have been subsidies to do this, but it's not really happened. So a very expensive transition to green energy has made all of Europe much more energy dependent, not energy independent, right? Because coal, as dirty as it is, you can dig coal in Germany. In fact, they still do. Yeah. Right. And nuclear, as bad as its PR is, well, nuclear is pretty independent. You only have to buy some uranium and some fuel, and it lasts you for a very, very long time. And there are plenty of countries around the world outside of Russia that would happily sell uranium to France or to Germany or to Britain. So when it comes to energy independence, I think there's need for a new energy policy where basically these sort of green goals of carbon reduction are married to a realistic plan for a geopolitical disentanglement from crucial rivals, right, with different interests, such as Russia.
And noting in particular nuclear power, which seems to have been smeared during, the middle, let's call it the third quarter of the 20th century, given the concerns about, or perhaps just after that with Chernobyl, some other nuclear disasters. It would seem to be a great option for energy independence, but kind of oddly, or maybe not so oddly, but a strategic mistake in Germany to shut down its nuclear energy program, and that you otherwise have separately have mentioned that even if they decided to reinstate that program now, they've lost so much of the personnel, expertise, and mind share. This is complicated stuff. You don't just spin up a nuclear plant or a bunch of nuclear plants, that those who could, the scientists and the personnel who could theoretically help support the nuclear energy options in furtherance of German energy independence are no longer there, and it's going to take them longer to implement this than people may suspect.
Yes, it's very much the case that these are highly sought after experts. And if you fire them, they move on. And you are not necessarily going to be able to hire alternatives, right? This has been an industry that's been shrinking, like strangled by both regulation and economic policy for 30 to 40 years. No one in their right mind goes into nuclear. It's not a growth industry. You have to be almost somewhat idealistic or just very, very interested in the physics of it, or just, for some reason, you just think it's kind of cool. And Germany has just been retreating from nuclear power at a rapid pace for the last 30 years, right? You choose to have many nuclear power plants. The last three, are set to be closed. It's something else to see a last minute reversal on the last few nuclear power plants. Even if this reversal is achieved, right, which is not going to be trivial, they keep these few nuclear power plants. How many decades will it take Germany to build the first new nuclear power plant? Yeah. How are you going to overcome the inertia of public, just public mistrust after like a 40, 50-year public relations campaign when you told the Germans that nuclear power was the most dangerous thing ever? And now you're telling them, look, we're building a new nuclear power plant near Hamburg. They're not going to like that. It's going to be politically extremely difficult. So what are you going to do? I think you're just going to keep on burning coal, because you will be forced to disentangle from Russia eventually. So perversely, what is supposed to be the cleanest energy policy will turn out to be the dirtiest.
Well, some suggest on the mimetic front that Greta Thunberg was actually a Russian propaganda tool and was to inspire, to catalyze bad strategic decisions from the West on energy, thus leaving them more dependent on the Russians. But I'll leave the speculation on Greta as Russian asset for others. So another aspect of the Russian energy situation that you had discussed that I found very interesting was the building of ports for Arctic transportation of potentially liquefied oil. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, what Russia's kind of projections are there. And I think you mentioned that they're considering that in terms of possibly replacing some Western demand with Chinese demand.
Right. The core problem with natural gas is that there's no real global market in natural gas, right? You need pipelines to deliver gas. You also can use pipelines to deliver oil. However, oil can be transported quite easily via tankers, right? So there is possible in principle to globalize oil energy markets for a variety of reasons. Different oils have different mixes of light and heavy oil and so on. So the oils aren't quite interchangeable. Often you, in fact, need to import for refining purposes foreign oil, even if on paper your domestic oil is enough to meet your supplies. So there are all sorts of interesting wrinkles here. But in principle, oil is liquid, easy to transport, easy to put on a tanker. Gas, right? You can compress natural gas, you can liquefy it, but this is so much more expensive. This is many times over more expensive than gas pipelines. But assuming the technology keeps going in that direction, how well positioned is Russia to, receive significant revenues in such a world? It turns out quite well. It turns out they're planning on this. They have built several nuclear-powered icebreakers, right? These are icebreakers that sail through the Arctic Sea, leading open routes available for other ships, be they cargo ships or possibly in the future tankers. Their goal is to open up a whole trade route passing the Arctic coast of Russia that can go either into the Atlantic or into the Pacific. This would be one of the most important political developments of the 21st century, one of the most important geopolitical developments of the 21st century. Even if one is skeptical of climate change, and one could even argue that Russia is betting on climate change, they want the world to be warmer, right? They want the Arctic ice to melt. Even if you're skeptical of that, the nuclear-powered icebreakers are a real investment. They've built several, and they are planning to build dozens more. What is the purpose of this? The purpose is an economic decoupling from Europe and a coupling with China. Trade would be much easier with China. This would also be a trade route that would not be constrained the same way usual Chinese trade is constrained, right? Through Southeast Asia, through the Straits of Malacca. It would give China strategic flexibility as well. Given recent sanctions, we have to ask ourselves, how long has Russia contemplated its own economic pivot to Asia, right? It's much less trade dependent on Europe right now, like as of before the invasion, right? I'm not going to talk about the effect of the sanctions. Just right before the invasion, Russia was less economically dependent on Europe than it had been at any other point in the last 25 years. The pivot to Asia, to China, had long ago begun in Russia. And we're talking now about the massive investments that will come to completion, whether or not, European sanctions persist, in Arctic ports, in the construction of many of these nuclear-powered icebreakers that I mentioned, in liquefied gas facilities that will allow them to export gas, by the way, directly from the Arctic provinces to China via ship, right? People don't realize that Russian gas does not come from deep inland within Siberia. It actually comes from the coastal provinces of Russia near the Arctic Sea. And it actually has to travel a really long way through these pipelines before it reaches Europe. So if Russia, if the US were to pressure Europe to take in natural gas via shipping from, let's say, the United States or Canada, it stops buying Russian gas. Maybe it decides American gas it's worth the price because it's a different geopolitical entanglement. Even in that case, in a world where natural gas is mostly now consumed in a liquefied way, Russia would be well positioned to export to China, to export to India, to export to literally anyone who might choose to buy it.
Be actually interesting. The vision of of modern Russia as a pseudo client state, almost of China, in kind of an inversion of the 20th century, with the Chinese less developed, kind of second mover communist state as the client state of the Soviet Union. Although there was there were some hostilities there, but interesting inversion of historic allies in that regard. Some people, make allusions to what the U.S. can do in the midterm and long term to kind of recalibrate this strategic imbalance and energy imbalance. Refer to the Keystone Pipeline, fracking. What are our options? What are the U.S.'s kind of strategic options to play here?
I think the United States should pursue a policy of energy abundance in North America, because almost no matter what you do energy-wise, it's a remarkably rich continent, especially the continental United States itself, but even close allies in Canada. For example, Canada has one of the largest uranium deposits in the world. There's certainly going to be more oil and gas in Canada's Arctic. I'm sure arrangements can be made for U.S. companies to exploit that. I think the big problem for the U.S., ironically, is not even the U.S. itself becoming energy independent. Is what does the U.S. do about its allies? Japan, Germany, Britain. These are places that have imported natural resources, processed them, and exported goods. They've been part of the American system, some of them for 70, 80 years, others less, right? Places like South Korea only really developed in the 90s and early 2000s. So how do you supply energy to those places is an interesting question. I think the U.S. can still export oil efficiently. It can export natural gas inefficiently. The U.S. cannot export nuclear. And here's the reason. It's just become very bad at building nuclear reactors. So if the US experienced like a nuclear renaissance and was capable of building dozens and hundreds of nuclear reactors, there would be a market for that in South Korea, in Japan, in Germany, eventually, if they come to their senses, in Britain, and so on, right? So that can be done. But if you think of something like solar, there's no way to bring sunshine to Japan or Germany or Britain. That exceeds our level of technology.
And thus far, available technologies are unable to corral solar energy. Is this even physically possible to corral solar energy into some sort of reservoir for use when the sun is not shining? Am I thinking sci-fi here, or is that even a possibility?
People have talked about the hydrogen economy, right, where you could store the energy in hydrogen and then you would burn the hydrogen. Burning hydrogen produces, water, because oxygen plus hydrogen, H2O. But I don't think this economy makes sense. I think the infrastructure needed to make that work would be more energy expensive than simply not doing it. So I think solar will be a good complement for power for two parts of the United States, especially. It really depends on how these two economies develop. But I think Texas and California are both extremely well positioned because they are the sunniest parts of the world that have advanced economies. There's no part of the world that's better positioned. If Turkey had the GDP of Germany, that's sort of the only part of the world that could use solar power as well as Texas and California can. And now I actually have a fun provocation. I actually think Texas is going to do a better job of making use of it than California, right? Because California does it in order to be green. Well, when Texas does it, they'll do it in order for it to be profitable. And it's not going to be beautiful, small solar panels on your roof. It's going to be, coating the desert in black silicon visible from space. It's really, really super scale solar, right? Like just using
much like putting
gobs and gobs of land, right? Huge tracts of land. Yeah.
Kind of like putting the chief of the IRS in charge of military revitalization. You're going to do it a lot when your objectives are purely economic and efficiency wise. You do things with a little more specificity.
Well, China currently builds 80% of the world's solar plants and solar panels. Wow. And I guarantee you it's not because they want to be green. Okay. It's because they know Californians and Germans will buy them. So they see a business opportunity. Yeah.
The communist, the utmost in economic efficiency. Who saw that coming? Okay, so let's see what we're staring at, and try to game out a couple potentialities here of where this conflict goes over the next, let's call it, 2 weeks to 2 months. We touched on it a bit earlier, but what the Russia victory scenario? How do you see that playing out?
Well, none of the scenarios are very happy from a purely humanitarian ground. But as we discussed, politics seldomly moves in line with, people's values and comfort. That's unfortunately one of the lessons of history. So I would say the Russian victory scenario is a relatively hard-won battle where all of Ukraine is occupied for a brief time. A rump Ukrainian state is established. It's notably smaller. If I had to guess again, I think some eastern territories, probably what connects Crimea to Donetsk and Luhansk. I think that goes directly to the Russian Federation. The remaining Ukrainian government joins the Russian and Belarusian Union state. The Russians do not do policing. That's carried out by this puppet government. The Russians have actually shown a remarkable ability to build and spin off statelets as needed, right? Let's remember South Ossetia, right, is a small statelet that broke away from Georgia that was successfully run by Russian-aligned politicians. Chechnya itself within the Russian Federation, Luhansk and Donetsk. Crimea even was briefly an independent state on paper before it rejoined the Russian Federation. So they're more than capable of creating the necessary civilian infrastructure. In a bizarre way, I would say, the Russians aren't really good at nation building, but they're good at state building, right? They don't build real countries, but they build really effective governing structures that keep control and keep alignment with Russia. So I think they will basically succeed at that. The economic damage is going to be severe. The victory scenario is where over the next few years, China really becomes Russia's economic lifeline. And then slowly over the years, as memories fade, the Western sanctions are walked back one step at a time. Imagine Iran, right? People are assuming Russia will collapse because if you sanctioned, Western European country the way Russia sanctioned, France's government would collapse, Spain's government would collapse. But Iran has been under this regime for decades. Similar severe sanctions, no collapse. Yeah. Cuba, similar severe sanctions, no collapse. North Korea, to go to an extreme example. I do not, by the way, Russia is not North Korea, okay? But the comparison to, say, a country like Iran, that's actually a sensible comparison. So imagine the sanctions are slowly walked back. Russia's considered basically a bad guy, but it just stays in its borders. And I actually think the end result is something like the Soviet Union light. It's like a new Russian empire. The Union state after Putin becomes stronger and stronger. And there's some sort of, this perception of Russia as separate from the West is strengthened. There's a new sort of mythology within Russia that, we are a unique civilization. We are doing something different from the West. And note, at that point, Russians will have been unable to travel in the Western world for 10 or 20 years. Memories of the West as a cultural influence will fade. So that is a strategic Russian victory, though it still leaves them subordinate to China. We can go to some other scenarios as well if those are interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to go to one, a stalemate scenario, and then two, the whatever scenario, forget the stalemate scenario. How about whatever scenario plays out that results in Vladimir Putin no longer being the ruler of Russia?
Well, this is still not a happy scenario. I think prolonged fighting, dragging on in Ukraine for the next 2 years. So Ukraine sort of becomes the Syria of, Europe. Many people leave, right? Syria is something like 25% of the population left. All the cities are destroyed. The government has a hard time remaining in power, but it sort of remains in power. And during this time, all of these mounting military defeats are blamed by Putin's inner circle on Putin. And Putin is replaced in a military coup. So if Putin is ousted, it's not going to be demonstrations. It's not going to be a flowering of democracy. It will be a military coup by a small junta of disaffected generals. This junta will not be interested in retreating from Ukraine, okay? That would undermine their own basis of legitimacy, but they will be interested in ceasing the fighting. So whatever the battle lines are in that year, the generals will try to make a treaty. They'll retreat. They will not return Crimea. They will not return Luhansk or Donetsk, but they might let go of all the other areas of Ukraine, and they might still insist on a large demilitarized zone. So you might have a really bizarre situation where that government even allows Ukraine's entry into NATO, but a special treaty designates the whole eastern half of the country a demilitarized zone. So that is the position where Putin is no longer in power. The other position is that, a nuclear war starts and he dies in the nuclear blast.
Not gallows humor, I guess, there, or whether intentional or unintentional.
Yes, very intentional. But, we have to understand a 2% a year risk of nuclear war is absolutely terrible. That means in 20, 30, 40 years, we might live to see such a war. And I think for stupid reasons, basically, we've all forgotten the reality of two massive doomsday machines, right? The American nuclear arsenal and the Russian nuclear arsenal. They hang over all of us like a sword of Damocles, and we shouldn't downplay that.
Absolutely not. And I think it's just this naivete, and it's kind of the people find it irresistible to wax histrionic about our options, about taking on the Russians and imposing no-fly zones, and the international community knocking out the Russian military, and without at all thinking about the second, third, or fourth order impacts here, and Vladimir Putin's own instincts for self-preservation, that these things don't always play out so well. And it's just such ignoring recent history and how our military adventures have not, the U.S.'s military adventures have not turned out well, even on a small level. And it's just, I find it very aggravating to hear otherwise smart people engage in this stuff incessantly.
I mean, the idea that one cannot defeat the Taliban, but can defeat Russia, I think that's a very questionable idea.
Yeah. Yeah, and they'll say, well, the objectives, the playing field is different. Well, regardless, if you haven't realized that that these things do not exist in a pure military silo, that you don't just go drop the bombs, blow up a couple things, and move on, and everything just falls into place. That's consistent across these scenarios.
Yeah, very much
absolutely. So. No doubt. And so, Samo, thank you so much for joining us here today. This was a masterclass on the history, the texture, the details, everything about this current conflict in between Russia and the Ukraine, the economic concerns and implications, mimetic versus kinetic, the whole kit and caboodle. Given your just unending knowledge about these topics and related topics, I have no doubt I will be calling you to appear here again as things continue to get very interesting in the world, and you're staying right on top of all of those topics and everything, making it interesting for better, for worse these days. So once again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the great conversation, Matt.
Absolutely. And just real quick before we go, where can people find you on social media? They
can find me at Samo Burja, Samo Burja on Twitter. They can also visit my website, samoburja.com, or subscribe to my company's strategic newsletter, brief.bismarck, Bismarck with a CK, analysis.com.
Fantastic.